Good evening. Welcome to our second Tuesday night hangout of the year 2016. Tonight I have with me for the first half hour Thomas Hudgins. We're going to talk about the text of the New Testament, especially, and then the second half hour we're going to be talking about capitalism with Elgin Hushbeck. So let's first invite the Lord to be with us and we'll get started. Lord, thank you for the opportunity to study and to learn and to discuss with one another. I pray that your Spirit will guide each and everything that we do and say in Jesus' name. Amen.
Amen.
Thomas, I'm looking right over here at a rather well-known edition of the New Revised Standard Version, the New Interpreter's Study Bible, but the Study Bible doesn't really have anything to do with it. Let me hold this up for our viewers. As you come down to the end of Mark, you get to Mark 16:8, which you're going to see over there on the right-hand side for me, and I believe the left-hand side for the viewers. We drop into headings. They say the first one says the shorter ending of Mark, which is very short. It's double brackets around it. Then the longer ending of Mark and double brackets, and then I have like 3 paragraphs worth of footnotes right over there at the end that explain to me, why this isn't necessarily really part of my Bible. When I run into something like that, what am I supposed to think as a church member?
Well, first of all, it's really good to be with you this evening, and hello to everybody who's watching the Hangout. This is actually a really important issue. I think in a perfect world, theoretically speaking, in a perfect world, kind of a utopia, we would never have to treat an issue like this. And I think a lot of times, people in our local churches, especially leaders in local churches that are regularly teaching the Bible and different things like that, they actually expect to never have to treat an issue like this. That is until you show up at a Sunday school class or you show up at a Bible study on a Tuesday night and you're reading from your New Testament and somebody raises their hand and they've got something different. Or somebody comes up to a pastor or a Bible study teacher or Sunday school teacher and says, hey, what's this note at the bottom of my Bible mean? And it's because of issues like that that we really need to be extremely prepared in order to treat this. So, Henry, the first thing that I want to say is when we have an issue like this, guess what? We really don't need to be afraid. There's some people out there that would love to say, hey, look, because you have a note down here and it's talking about some manuscripts saying one thing and other manuscripts saying another thing, that all of a sudden our whole world and our whole faith needs to collapse. It's really not the case. I sleep fine every single night, and I know of a lot of variants in the manuscripts of the New Testament. I haven't lost a moment of sleep because of this. Mark 16 is a really interesting issue. Before we talk about it, though, can we talk a little bit about what actually happened with the transmission of the text of the New Testament? Would that be okay?
I think that would be an excellent idea. I think because that's going to be part of the answer to this, I would say, is how are you going to talk to somebody?
Yeah. So prior to the 15th century, guess what the world didn't have? I can hear one in the background right now in the library. Somebody's making a copy of something. It's a much more high-tech version of what was invented in the 15th century. But prior to the 15th century, there was no mechanical printing press that would mass-produce copies of things. It just didn't exist, and it certainly didn't have an HP on the side or a different. It wasn't high quality. There was no laser inkjet printing going on in the 15th century. So what happened from basically around the year AD 40, when the New Testament around that time when the New Testament begins to be written, up until the 15th century, what did people have to do? Every time people were either disseminating or the gospel would go to a new place, or these manuscripts would go to new places, people had to make copies of these manuscripts by hand. In some regard, it's really hard for some of us to understand just how meticulous this is. But when you talk about copying something word for word, and you start, it becomes overwhelming sometimes when I think about it. I can't imagine in the first century, especially like
Well, I'm not sure exactly what's going on. Right now I seem to have lost Thomas, so I'm not entirely certain what people are seeing. I know my internet connection is still functioning, so if you give us a moment here on our technical issues, I'll see what's going on. We do have the Q&A app active, so if you want to bring in any comments or questions, feel free to do that. If you came in on YouTube, you'll be able to click on a banner, and Thomas will get back to you in just a second, since I was watching that, since we lost you. If you're watching this on YouTube, there's should be a banner that will let you share in the conversation, and that will allow you to enter questions or comments, and also to see. We'll be using some of the showcase to show you websites and options. Again, if you're come in via YouTube, use that banner to click through. So, Thomas, you're talking about the meticulous effort of copying the manuscripts. I've sometimes done this, especially with classes of teenagers. When I have to teach this, I'll go write an unspaced equal number of columns of text in all caps in English, plain English, but use all caps, no spaces, and say 40 columns across, and give them a short paragraph and have them copy it around the room, sort of like playing grapevine or telephone, as it used to be called. And it's interesting to see what happens at the end. You'll actually see scribal corrections take place as somewhere down the line somebody decides that can't be what it is and fixes it and ends up fixing it into something that was certainly not.
Yeah.
So that gives you an idea. It takes a lot of work. Anyway, let's hand that back to you now. I think you're back with us.
Yeah, so basically what I was saying earlier before we got disconnected, before the conversation dropped, you really open the door whenever you're copying something by hand for some other things to happen to the text. This happened a lot. But what's interesting when you go through and look at the text of the text of the New Testament in the different manuscripts they were copied to, you really don't have this major, huge problem that some people might say that there is. I mean, for example, Henry, I've been looking at all of the manuscripts that are at the Vatican, all of the manuscripts that are at the Vatican for the Gospel of Matthew, and you know what we have? We've got the Gospel of Matthew. There's nothing really super crazy going on with these manuscripts. And so it's one thing that I want to just encourage everybody, that when they see these notes at the bottom of their translation that say some manuscripts say this, some manuscripts say something else, it's really not that earth-shattering. And examples like the one that we have in Mark chapter 16, which you pointed out at the beginning of the Hangout, that's really unusual in comparison to the other types of issues that are going on with the manuscripts. Mark 16 is quite unique because you have a very large section of the Gospel of Mark that is in question. So some manuscripts have Mark chapter 16 ending at verse 8. Some other manuscripts have Mark chapter 16 ending all the way at verse 20. So it adds verses 9 through 20. And there's some other issues inside of that, but the main issue is whether or not those additional verses were original to the Gospel of Mark or whether they weren't. There's some other issues in the New Testament that obviously, let me just say this, Henry. Obviously, we're not talking about somebody really forgetting to write down a word or changing a letter and misspelling a word. That's not what's going on at the ending of Mark. Somebody had to intentionally add, if it's not original, had to intentionally add those additional verses. As well, if it is original, then somebody left off a major chunk, which is possible. Some of these manuscripts, somebody could have written on the front of a leaf. Somebody could have written on the front of a leaf, and then when they went to make the copy, it ended at verse 8. They never flipped it over and saw verse 9 and the rest of the chapter. That's possible as well. There's all these different ways where we have to think about what was actually going on in the 1st century, in the 2nd century, in the 3rd century, where these manuscripts could have, where the change took place and why the change took place. If I can.
Well, before you go on here, Thomas, let's get in a word or two about what it is that you're doing. First, I'm going to bringing up in the showcase the book that Thomas currently has with Energion Publications, which is the Spanish translation of David Allen Black's Greek grammar. That, however, is not really the key. Give us just about probably 30 seconds or so what it is that you're doing here with your dissertation. You mentioned all these manuscripts of the Gospel of Matthew. Now, this is another meticulous process I know that you're going through, and I just want people to understand something about, what goes on behind the scenes, the kind of work that you're doing, collating there on certain things. Just give us a brief before you go forward, so people understand what you do with this.
So we literally have over 5,000 manuscripts of the New Testament. I mean, we have so many copies of the New Testament text. It's incredible, and a lot of these are very, very, very. But a lot of them are before the 10th century. Listen, I'm taking the first printed Greek New Testament, which was in Alcalá de Henares, which is in Spain. They printed the first Greek New Testament back in 1514. I'm taking that Greek New Testament and I'm comparing all the Vatican manuscripts to the Gospel of Matthew in that New Testament. And the reason I'm doing that, so I'm taking the Greek of that printed Greek New Testament and I'm comparing it to the Greek of the manuscripts that are at the Vatican. Why am I doing that? Just to kind of see, is one of those manuscripts at the Vatican look like the first printed Greek New Testament Gospel of Matthew? And what you end up doing is you just mark all of the differences from that Greek New Testament to all of the manuscripts at the Vatican, and you start to see that there's differences really in every single chapter of the Gospel of Matthew. 90% of them are really inconsequential. Only sometimes do you have an issue that we have to pay attention to.
Okay, the reason let me bring something in here. I want people to understand here what goes into the work, because I think English-speaking people especially pick up Bible translations and they don't realize what work has gone on so that they can have what they hold in their hands. Sometimes I think we're just... So I reached up here to pull a Greek New Testament off. I'm going to hold this up here. And what this does is after somebody has done that kind of work, then you get the results in a book. Now, this has much less detail than the kind of work that you're doing for the Gospel of Matthew, and then further people are taking and translating that. I just wanted to bring out that point.
Just to give you an idea, Henry, look at this. This is the text of Matthew, and every time you see a green, a manuscript of the Vatican agrees. Every time you see a red, it disagrees.
Right.
So I'll just I'll just drop it through a little bit just so you can see. So there's red. You see on every page there's red. But it's not that big of a deal.
Okay, now I'll let you back onto your train track there.
All right. So the question is, do we really need to know what's going on with these different readings that are mentioned in our footnotes? And I would argue that, yeah, we do need to have a sort of understanding of what went into the transmission of the text of the New Testament. Let me just give you two examples of where it matters, similar to what you see in Mark chapter 16, but a little different, because I actually think it matters for how we understand what the New Testament tells us. It's not like all of these variants are spelling errors. They're really not, or spelling mistakes, or whatever you want to call them. In Matthew chapter 5, verse 22, if you open up a New King James version of the Bible, a New King James translation of the Bible, it'll say, if anyone is angry with his brother without cause, then he's liable to the court. If you open up a New American Standard Bible, it's going to omit the words without cause or without a reason. So if anyone's angry, he's guilty before the court. Now, it matters because which one did Jesus say? Did Jesus say you can't ever get angry? Or did Jesus say you can't get angry unless you have I'm from the South, so I'll say this, a doggone good reason?
Okay, look, just one real quick thing. Both the NKJV and the New King James and the New American Standard Bible are translated by really solid evangelical translation teams with a high view of Scripture. This is not some kind of an argument over the authority of the Bible.
It's not.
I just wanted to point that out because I've done the same thing with some of the translations between others. That, in any case, you're talking two groups, high view of Scripture, and seriously intending to present us with the meaning of the text.
Yeah. So how do they get something different? There's actually one word in Greek in Matthew 5:22 that some manuscripts say is there, and some manuscripts say it's not there. Okay, some manuscripts have it, some manuscripts don't. So there's usually a note at the bottom of the page, just like there is for Mark 16, verses 9 through 20. So how do these well-respected gentlemen and gentle ladies, in some cases, how do they get one reading for the New King James Version and one reading for the New American Standard Bible? And here's the answer to that question. The two groups are thinking that the two groups are putting different weight on different manuscripts. Okay, so when you look at the New American Standard Bible, they look at the manuscripts that don't have this word that translates without a cause, and they go, "Oh, those are the best manuscripts, or those are more trustworthy manuscripts, so we're going to go with that reading." Whereas the people with the New King James Version look at the manuscripts and they say, "Oh, well, these manuscripts don't have this word, but these other manuscripts do have this word." And then they start thinking about a little bit of different criteria, and they come up with an answer where they say, "You know what? We're going to include that word." So they're just looking at different evidence, or they're looking at the same evidence, but they're thinking about it and they're answering the questions differently. So there's actually one other one that I want to point out real fast. Matthew 5:22. Does it matter? Does it matter? It matters to me, and I know it matters to each of you. Either Jesus said you can never get angry, or Jesus says you can never get angry without a reason. It's one or the other. By the way, if just getting angry is a problem, if just getting angry is sin, then we have to wrestle with what Jesus was doing when he got, fill in the blank, angry or upset or something when he was in the temple and made a whip. And, anger in and of itself is not inherently wrong or evil. It's not inherently sinful. But anyways, there's another one. There's one in John chapter 1, verse 41, where one letter is different. One letter is different in some manuscripts. And so in John chapter 1, verse 41, John chapter 1, verse 41, and I'll read it for John chapter 1, verse 41, it says, he found first his own brother Simon and said to him, we have found the Messiah, which translated means Christ. Well, there's an interesting variant in John chapter 1, verse 41. That word first, in some manuscripts, it ends with a Greek letter that's like the equivalent of the English letter S. And then some of them end the word with a different letter, which is like the English equivalent of the letter N. When those words are different, though, when those letters are different, it changes what that word means in those manuscripts. So you have two options here. Option one is it could be saying this. Option one, he found first his own brother, Simon, and said to him, or option two, it could be he first found his brother, Simon, and said to him. Now, what's the significance there? Well, it's interesting. Is John saying that he was this disciple, the first thing he did was he went and got his brother? Or is it saying he was the first one who went and got his brother? Now, those are two different options. Either the first thing he did was he went and got his brother, or he was the first one who went to get his brother. All right, what does that mean? What difference does that make? Well, for one, it tells us something about the Great Commission, if you ask me. Should we understand, if I look at this passage and it's option one, the first thing he did was he went and got his brother, it tells me that there's actually a time when you can actually tell Jesus to wait. There's something more important than going and hanging out with Jesus. You know what's more important than going and hanging out with Jesus? Going and bringing other people to know Jesus. That's more important than hanging out with Jesus. And that's what he did. He went and got his brother. If it's option two, what does it tell us? If it's option two, if it's he was the first one who went and got his brother, then that means that there was another person who had a brother, and he went and got his brother and brought him to Jesus. All right. I say all of that, Henry, just to say this. There are variants, or there are readings different in the manuscripts that do affect that do affect what the New Testament text says. That's true. None of those variants, though, none of those alternative readings, none of them change the heart and the soul of the New Testament. We have the message of the New Testament, without a doubt. It's only these very, 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 really few places in the New Testament where the meaning or the way we would understand what the text says changes. Mark 16 is an example. John chapter 7, 53 through 8:11 is an example. Matthew 5:22, John 1:41, and there's one in every single book of the New Testament. There's multiple ones in most of the books of the New Testament that are important like that. But in no way, shape, or form does it really change, whether or not we know what the authors in the first century actually said. And in no way, shape, or form does it ultimately change what we know about Orthodox theology.
Okay. So, as I was looking at Matthew 5:22, I have my Greek over here, but that really wasn't what I was most interested in today. I pulled out Matthew 5:22, and there you have the note. The one that catches people, it says, other ancient authorities add without cause.
Do you know why they say ancient authorities and not manuscripts?
I guess I could make a stab at it, but
no, I'm asking. I don't know.
No, my only stab at it is that it probably, when they're they may not be wanting to talk about patristic sources, for example, as manuscripts. That would be my guess.
Yeah, well, I was just thinking that it would be interesting if if that's the way it refers all the way through, the translation you're using, if it says that consistently. But
well, this New Revised Standard, and I think that is their standard way of, they just use ancient authorities as the phrasing for almost all.
Yeah.
I'd have to look to be sure, but that's my memory.
Yeah, it makes sense to me. And I would bet you anything that they're trying to be consistent, one, and two, it's including patristics, or like not just, it's including the early church, the way that they cited or referred to these different readings as well.
Well, I mean, that would bring it back to your earlier point. You're talking about having 5,000 manuscripts, but as far as the New Testament is concerned, there are 5,000 Greek manuscripts of all or a portion. And one thing people should be aware is that those are not. Don't think of them as complete scrolls or complete codices of the whole. They vary from the size of a couple of inches across up through a codex of the entire New Testament. But then you have thousands more lectionary texts. You then have all of the patristic references, which some people may miss what we're talking about there. Patristic reference is when one of the church fathers, in talking about the scriptures and so on, quotes or alludes to or even paraphrases, because in certain cases you can even tell what text was behind, even if you know that the church father was paraphrasing. And then beyond that, you go into translations into Latin, Ethiopic, Syriac, and so on and so forth. So so you multiply the number of available manuscripts, and that may be another reason, speaking of, why they use authorities.
Yeah.
So you end up really with a fairly, as you're saying, with a quite small percentage of the New Testament text. And this is probably a distinction that for people who don't do this, we should make. It's not, because you flipped through those pages and showed us all the red. The majority of those, if you got a group of textual scholars in the room, there really wouldn't be a dispute over what the most likely original text was.
No.
There's only a small percentage that's in this kind of dispute that we're talking about with, say, Matthew 5:22, or, and I was remembering 1 John 5:7 and 8, although there's a fairly substantial majority on that one, but still, the majority of it, the text, is not actually disputed.
Hey, just a fun side note. Going through the manuscripts of the Vatican, I realized that the people that were copying these manuscripts were very much like us. I don't know if you've ever doodled when you were in church, but I have occasionally had a pen and paper and doodled. Well, I found a manuscript on Monday that I was going through in the Gospel of Matthew at the Great Commission, right beside the Great Commission, Matthew 28. There was this ferocious fish drawn in the margin, and he had these like gigantic teeth, and you could see a squiggly line from his fin, and then another fin drawn behind that, and it was like designed to show movement. And I thought to myself, I stepped back in time, and I thought to myself, somebody got bored right now.
Which should remind us that when we talk about manuscripts, ancient authorities, and what it has, for somebody, this was their Bible.
Yeah.
All of these things that we may say this is a better or worse manuscript or whatever, but for somebody that was their Bible.
Yeah.
We're talking about, and you put a real human, a human touch on it. We're actually out of time. I want to say a couple of words about you and what you do again. I already mentioned the Dave Black's Greek grammar translated into Spanish. I still have that up in the showcase. Aprenda a leer el griego del Nuevo Testamento. My Spanish is a little rusty, but there we go. And Now what I'm going to do, there is a special coupon code entered in our Energion Direct, energiondirect.com, and you can click the link right there in the showcase. 0112. The code is 0112. Will give you 30% off of that for the next 30 days. Now, I'm not going to put this in the description or the comments or anything like that. So if you've watched the video, 0112, 30% off. That's $14 for this Greek grammar complete with all of the exercises. So if and $14 is more than $10, and the reason that's important is that we ship free for all orders over $10. So straight $14, you can have the printed copy, and if I do say so myself as the publisher and the one who did the page layout, it is a beautiful book. So go ahead, Thomas.
It is beautiful, yeah, there's no doubt.
Okay, and then one last thing about Thomas here is we do have him under contract to give us one of our topical line drives. It's less than 44 pages on the textual criticism, and I sincerely hope and pray that that will be of help to people who have to answer the question without serious training in textual criticism when the Sunday school class says, my note here says other ancient authorities read, and it makes this text say something else. How are we going to discuss that? So, Thomas, thanks for being with us. I'm going to be mentally shifting gears here because I'm going to be talking to Elgin Hushbeck about capitalism. That is, provided he doesn't jump in here and decide he wants to say something about textual criticism after all of this, because he's done a little bit of it there himself as well. Before I turn to Elgin, however, let me give a couple of announcements. This year, we'll be scheduling our Tuesday night hangouts in either 15 or 30-minute segments. Really, a 30-minute segment will generally be about 27 minutes. And so that we'll have some shorter and topical sections for you. And then we're coordinating somewhat, and I'm bringing this into our showcase, our Energion discussion network. That's energion.co/discuss. We'll have a link to that that's available. And then starting tomorrow morning, for our fiction and poetry authors, we've started a new blog called Nurturing Creativity. The first article will appear tomorrow morning. And I'm going to have a link there for that as well. The first article by Dr. Dolly Berthelot is going to be talking about boxes. The cliche of thinking outside the box will come up in that. So we'll have that. The first article will come up tomorrow. Now I'm going to switch to Elgin, and as I'm switching to him, let me mention that he is co-host of our Global Christian Perspectives, which happens each Friday now at 4 p.m., co-hosting with Chris Eyre. I always like to say he's the left side of the pond and the right side of the political spectrum, and Chris is the right side of the pond and the left side of the political spectrum. I'm not sure how fair that is, but I think it's pretty fair. So, Elgin, welcome.
Well, it's good to be here.
I'm going to click on this and bring in the card for anybody who's following our showcase for preserving democracy. That's kind of Elgin's magnum opus, I guess, on politics. And let's start with the straightforward question. I know you're going to be writing for the discussion network about capitalism and Christianity. Is capitalism consistent with Christianity? But how about just a short version as we're getting into it here, and then I want to talk some about, as a Christian, what would you see as valid within capitalist system?
Okay, well, yeah, I've actually already written it and submitted it to Steve, so it's ready to go up as soon as he's got it scheduled. But the quick answer is it consistent with Christianity? Yes. Anything else?
Okay. Well, actually, I've
probably hoping for a bit more.
I would have accepted a half dozen more words, but I'm okay with the yes. So let's jump right in here into the key item, and I think I have a fair idea how you're going to answer it, but probably the great criticism of capitalism as compatible with Christianity comes from the issue of the care for the poor, the care for those who are less fortunate. The fundamental view is to say a capitalist is about the rich getting richer, the poor getting poorer, and that it is not about caring for people who are less fortunate. Christianity, on the other hand, is about caring for those who are less fortunate. Draw some lines there.
Well, the first thing I would point out is there's a couple of things that I want to point out, but the first one would be is that description of capitalism comes from its critics. And whenever we rely on the critics of something to provide us the definition, we always have to be a little suspect, because normally critics don't put things in the best light. They tend to put things in the most negative light. And so this whole idea of capitalism is the rich getting richer and the poor getting poorer is, to me, that's not capitalism, not in any way, shape, or form. When you get to the core of capitalism, I guess one other thing I want to, before I go into that, is to say that when we're dealing with economic systems, we're not really dealing with biblical systems. Economics is the study of how do you deal with scarce commodities. I mean, if something is so abundant like air, then it doesn't really come under the whole concept of economics, because it's just everywhere, everyone has it. Unless you're underwater or gasping for breath or something, there's no real perceived need for it. So it doesn't really fall into economics. What falls into economics are resources that are scarce. And economics is the study of how to produce and then how to distribute those scarce resources. So with that kind of a background, we don't expect a complete lineup between biblical values and economic systems to begin with. But we can do some. One of the things we can look for in an economic system is, as a Christian, I look for, because how does it deal with the poor? How does it deal with people? How does it react on the individual? Things like that. So this whole core of capitalism isn't the rich getting richer and the poor getting poorer. The core of capitalism is how are you going to allocate these resources? And the two main systems we have today are what can loosely be called capitalism and what can loosely be called socialism. There's no such thing as a pure system either way, but one deals with individual choice in a marketplace. That would be the capitalist side, where the individual in the marketplace with competition chooses what's best for them. On the socialist side is the idea of centralized planning to some degree or another, where usually government or some entity will allocate resources based on some sort of plan that they've put together as to what they think people will want or what people will need. And when you look at those two systems, that's the real core. What we also want to look at is, what do the systems produce? And I think history is pretty clear. Capitalism has resulted in more prosperity for more people than any other economic system that has ever been devised. One of the real benefits of capitalism concerning the poor is the worst form of poverty, the less than $1 a day poverty, has been cut 70% in the last 40 years through the implementation of capitalistic ideas and policies such as microcredit. So beforehand, this policies of socialist redistribution from one government to another failed miserably. It enriched the people in the governments, but didn't really help the people at the poor. On the other hand, we start introducing capitalist ideas like microcredit, and we see the poverty level for these people has fallen 80%. Still a lot of work to do, but bottom line is capitalism has produced a much better standard of living and a much better well-being for millions of people.
Okay, let me remind everybody the book that we're focusing on, although Elgin has written a number, is called Preserving Democracy. And one of the elements in there is capitalism. The book is not a book about economics purely, but it has a lot. And also, I'll remind you that I have the Q&A app up. Now, Elgin, when you're talking about capitalism, the first thing I want to clarify on this, really we're talking about how the capital is handled more. The capital is in the hands of private people, meaning for those, I mean, that's the complicated way of saying the money is in the hands of individuals as opposed and controlled by, as opposed to the government. And should probably give you a chance at some point in there to talk about the Nazi economy, where the capital was theoretically in the hands of private individuals, but in practice was very centrally planned, as I understand it.
Yeah, well, if you take the Nazis and you take a look at the full name of the Nazis is just an abbreviation for Nationalsozialismus, which is the National Socialist German Workers' Party. Not exactly what you would find in your normal right-wing group. Yeah, right-wing, the Nazis were a left-wing group.
They didn't actually nationalize.
No, well, they were not nationalized, but a national. The big difference between communism and fascism in Nazi Germany or in Italy is, whereas communism is found in the Soviet Union, was very much a global enterprise seeking world domination, and they believed in centralized control of everything. Everything was owned by the state. Nazism was a derivative of that, where they were focusing much more on the state, be it Italy, be it Nazi Germany. They focused on the state, and they allowed people to maintain ownership of property as long as the ultimate control was ceded to the government. So the government had very, very much control over the economy, but they allowed ownership by private individuals. So those are the two key things. But you're still dealing, whether you're in Nazi Germany or in the Soviet Union, you're still dealing with a planned centralized economy.
Okay, so you can have probably the same effect of the planning and the centralization, even if you technically on paper are saying this belongs to so-and-so. If the control is fully in the hands of the government, it's going to be, in terms of economic result, it's going to be much like a socialist, or almost as if the business had been nationalized.
Yeah, and I'd also point out, by the way, that one of the common caricatures of capitalism by those who disagree with it is that capitalism is the corporate bigwigs running everything, big oil, big business. And that is just as much a distortion of capitalism as socialism would be. I'm not saying that is one of the points I make in my article. I'm saying that corporate leaders getting together and planning the economy, I don't consider that socialism, but it is still a distortion of capitalism, because capitalism, the key component of capitalism is you want to move that decision-making power down to the individual as much as possible. And you want competition so that the individual has a choice as to how they will spend their money.
Okay, now before I have a question having to do with the control and the corporate connection, but first, since you've said, and I would certainly agree, that there haven't been any pure, or there really aren't any pure examples of either system.
Right.
Would you be able to pull out of your hat, say, an example or so of the most socialist system that we've seen, and say the most capitalist system that we've seen historically so far?
Well, the most socialist would probably be a contender for that would be one of the communist countries, be it the Soviet Union, be it the Soviet or the communist China. When the communists were extremely much in power, those ultimately fail. And one of the things about socialism is it requires a centralized plan, and a plan to enforce requires centralized power. And the more you proceed to that, the more you end up in a totalitarian state, which is why not all socialist governments end up totalitarian. Western Europe has socialist governments, but they're not quite totalitarian. But they also don't quite work very well because the plan always fails. And then how do you deal with that? So somewhere I would say probably Soviet Union, Red China, maybe one of the other smaller communist countries would be in the contender for the most socialist. On the other hand, I would say the United States in the late part of the 19th century, early part of the 20th century was a good contender for the most capitalist. But capitalism is an emerging system. You could also possibly say maybe places like Hong Kong or other places where they don't have, they have very much free markets. But one of the problems you have that capitalism always fights is the centralization of power. And what happens usually is as people get power, they appeal to government, and government then protects big business. Oftentimes, socialists claim that government is the defender against big business. In reality, it's actually the defender of people against big business. In reality, it is actually the defender of big business. If you look at recent legislation, for example, Dodd-Frank or any of the major legislation, essentially the big banks got together for Dodd-Frank, helped Congress write the law, and it ends up, the result is we've gone from 10 banks which were too big to fail down to 5 banks that we can no longer let fail. And small bank production in the United States has literally disappeared. Where we used to create 100 small banks a year, we've created one in the last 9 years.
Okay, I'm going to take just a moment here and remind people, I'm not putting it in the description or the comments, but coupon code 0112 and Elgin's book, Preserving Democracy. And as a matter of fact, all of Elgin's books will be 30% off with that coupon code. So that's 0112, and I have the link in the showcase right now. So remember to look at that. So when we're talking about the control of the economy, and I'm switching the Q&A back on if anybody's any of our audience has questions or comments. When you're talking about control of the economy, we have a phenomenon where a regulator, when you're talking about the government supposedly protecting individuals against the large corporations, but where a regulatory body becomes very much controlled by the industry, or at least they become very much working in parallel. Is that, I guess, just comment on that part of control?
Yeah, I mean, that's essentially what happens is most of these government agencies, they usually fall into one of two extremes. One, they become extremely hostile to business, where they make it very difficult for business to even exist or to expand or do anything. On the other hand, they get basically in bed with business, and they just sort of let the people with the power and the influence go ahead and write the regulations so that basically it forces everybody to do things the way that they're already doing it. A lot of these regulations are set up such that it's barriers to entry to keep smaller people from coming out. One of the things you have with a big business is they tend to get layered down in bureaucracy, and they just do things because that's the way they've always done them. And one of the big advantages that a small new business has coming up is they can innovate. They can come up with brand new ways of looking at a problem, brand new innovative solutions into the market, and they can enter into a market. And if they're successful and people like what they're doing, people will begin to choose them over the older big business, and they will succeed. What happens is government comes in and they say, well, if you're going to enter this marketplace, then you've got to do things the way that the big businesses, the existing businesses, are already doing them. Those are the so-called best practices, and that's how you must run your business, which makes it very difficult for a young new business to innovate and come up with a brand new interesting way. You see this going on right now with the old taxi companies that are very highly regulated, and new internet companies like Uber, which are innovative ways of basically addressing the same problem.
Okay, now one of the criticisms of socialism from a capitalist, and you've really used it here, is it doesn't work. But one of the has all the features except doesn't actually work. But similarly, from somebody who leans toward the socialist side, and to be quite honest, I don't know of anybody arguing a truly socialist system that would be absolute, or really a absolute in the sense that I would see it. But the same argument would be brought up on what you just said, with the tendency to get government in the pocket of the business, or the business in the pocket of the government, and so on. Is it workable? Is there going to be a capitalist system that works the way that you're suggesting, and continues to work that way over time? In other words, or are we actually here going to say that we have two economic systems, neither of which actually manages to do what it should do in theory?
Well, I think capitalism does work. You can see this, for example, in the tremendous growth and productivity that's occurring in areas like the internet, and Uber being a good example. That's very much unregulated by the government. And what's happening is people are coming in, they're saying, hey, let's try this. And most of them fail. But every once in a while, someone comes up with a really good idea that people like and they flock to. And then suddenly lots of imitators come up, and the industry improves, and wealth is generated, and people get jobs. So yes, it can work. The big thing about the internet and the age that we're basically just now entering into is this whole aspect of information. And what government did before, the rise of the powerful government we have now, you can trace back to people like Sinclair Lewis, the progressives at the beginning of the 20th century. And there they were focusing on what was very clearly a problem with businesses like meatpacking houses that were putting out who knows what and selling it, and nobody had any idea. And thus we passed laws, which were well-deserved at the time, to have government regulators come in and give people some assurance that what they were buying is what they were actually wanting to buy, and there was some sort of quality standards. Well, nowadays people can't keep up with that. The government certainly can't keep up with that. And actually we're finding social media and Facebook are providing information to customers and consumers much, much faster than the government is. And the legal system is such that most companies don't worry too much about government regulators, other than as a burdensome, useless cost that they have to endure. What they really worry about, if they don't put out a good product, is they're going to get bad social media, or if they put out a really bad product, they're going to get sued. So that's where the control is. It's not government regulators any longer. The only thing government regulators are doing is just jacking up the cost and impeding innovation and new approaches to business. So as we move forward, I think government needs to change from trying to regulate business and trying to ensure they're doing things the way they think they should be doing them. And instead, government does have a role, but that role is to make sure that there is competition in the marketplace, that there is a level playing field, that anybody can enter into a business, assuming they can make a go of it, and they shouldn't be trying to keep people out the way they are now.
So do you see any role then for government regulation in the capitalist system, that is including fraud prevention beyond the normal law enforcement, you told a lie, but saying, this label means such and such? For example, is that something that you allow an option for? Or even though, as you're saying now, you're saying that it's not relevant because of the information age?
Yeah, there's going to be some minimum standards, but that's what they should be, minimum standards that everybody can meet. So everyone's playing on the same the same playing field. But it's going to be on a case-by-case basis. It's not that government interaction is wrong or bad. It's what are they trying to do when they intervene? Are they trying to regulate, or are they trying to encourage competition? If their goal is to encourage competition, encourage a level playing field, and then stand back and let people compete in the marketplace, that's the proper role for government. I'd also say there's going to be a role for government in terms of a sort of, a minimum, call it a safety net or whatever, in terms of the economy and those aspects. That needs to be carefully managed, but there's definitely a role there. So it's not like, well, you didn't succeed in the marketplace, therefore you're out on the street. There needs to be some provision there, but we have to make sure that we're encouraging people, we're encouraging, for example, rather than low unemployment, I would rather the government focus on, what is keeping jobs from being created. And right now, the answer to what is keeping jobs from being created is very often government itself.
Okay, so when you actually jumped right into the question that I intended, because we're running out of time. This will probably be the last. It's talking about the safety net. What kind of safety net programs would you feel that you could sign on to? Because I'm sure for many Christians, the safety net program is the sort of thing that, they feel the need of in order to be able to support a capitalist kind of economy.
Yeah. Well, for one, I think it should be, as in most things, the closer to the people, the better. It should be it shouldn't be done at a federal level. It should be done more and more at the local level where people have control. One of the things that you find, there's a big key difference between a not quite capitalist, but where capitalism thrives is under a limited government. Because the bigger government is, the more opportunity for corruption and the less impact people will have on their government. And so moving government to a local level, encouraging people to do donations. One of the things that we get, capitalists get a bad rap is we're supposed to be greedy. And yet when you look at the actual studies on giving, people who are capitalists and who support capitalist systems are much more generous with their time and their funds than people who are socialists. So, because they're not depending on the government to do it. So I think private organizations, nonprofits, look at all the money that's raised by nonprofits in this country. They can do a good job of it. If you have a thriving economy, the need for these programs diminishes a lot. And then as a very last resort, preferably on a limited basis, unless there's some sort of disability, government help. And then it should be local government first.
Okay, we're running out of time, although I have far from run out of questions. And I think that probably an excellent topic for a later half hour on these Hangouts would be to talk about the relationship between how shall I say, sustaining capitalism as a workable system and the limited government, which you're talking about there at the end. But with somewhere in the neighborhood of 45 seconds left, I think we probably will not manage to do that tonight. So I just want to remind everybody, coupon code 0112 at energiondirect.com. If you're on Google Plus, or if you use the banner on your YouTube to go to log in, you'll be able to follow the link. All of Elgin's books will be 30% off with that coupon code 0112 for the next 30 days. So if you're watching this video on YouTube within the 30 days, you can use that coupon code 0112. And the book that we've been discussing is Preserving Democracy, and that is also available on those cards. Elgin, thanks for being with us tonight, and I will definitely make sure to schedule some time for us to discuss the connection between limited government and capitalism, and I will certainly schedule some time for one of your socialist opponents to say nasty things about you. So,
It'd
or
be hard to find.
probably schedule some time for you to say nasty things to each other in person.
Oh, we never do that.
Well, Global Christian Perspectives, Friday afternoon at 4 p.m. Elgin and Chris Eyre do definitely know how to go at one another in a fairly reasonable fashion, I think. So watch our YouTube channel. That's also on those showcase cards. You can get a link to subscribe to the YouTube channel. We'll be putting up announcements of the Global Christian Perspectives discussion. And for tonight, we are out of time. Thank you for watching, and I hope you have a great week. I think we're finishing just about the time President Obama is starting the State of the Union. So those who watch political speeches can go and do that. So again, thanks, Elgin.
Thank you.